Close your eyes, traveler. The year is 1492, an age that smells of incense and rot, of gold and blood. The bells of Rome ring not for prayer, but for power. Above the narrow streets, the domes of the Vatican gleam in the sun like polished armor. Below, the Tiber carries away the secrets of men who confess by day and conspire by night. This is not the Rome of saints. It is a kingdom disguised as a church. Here, faith is a currency. Every sermon, every sin, every absolution has its price. Pilgrims arrive from every corner of Christendom to kiss relics and buy forgiveness. Cardinals dine like princes, draped in silk, surrounded by servants and spies. The poor kneel in the dust while the rich purchase eternity. And at the center of it all sits a man who is about to become Pope. His name, Rodrigo Borgia. He is not Roman by birth. He comes from Spain, a man of cunning, charm, and unshakable appetite. In him lives the perfect contradiction, priest and politician, father and sinner, lover and killer. He has waited decades in the shadow of other popes, biding his time, counting favors like coins in the dark. Now, the throne of St. Peter stands empty. The papal conclave gathers, and every door that closes behind them seals a dozen private bargains. Gold changes hands. Promises of bishoprics, land and salvation are whispered between men who should speak only to God. When the smoke rises from the Sistine Chapel, it is not heaven that has chosen. It is Rodrigo Borgia. He takes the name Alexander VI. The Church calls it divine providence. Rome calls it something else, a purchase. That night, as candles flicker across the city, the courtesans of Trastevere raise their cups to the new pope. The soldiers drink, the merchants laugh, the cardinals scheme. Only the monks pray, and even their prayers sound tired, for they know what kind of man has just inherited the keys to heaven. From this moment on, the Vatican will not be ruled by a shepherd, but by a family. The Borgias, a dynasty of blood and silk. Rodrigo, the patriarch, charming, calculating, obsessed with legacy. Cesare, the warrior son, brilliant, cruel, born for power but chained by the church. Lucrezia, the daughter, beautiful, intelligent, and destined to be both bride and weapon. And behind them all a web of lovers, cardinals, and assassins, bound not by faith, but by ambition. The city of God has become a stage, and the play is sin. Every prayer hides a motive, every confession conceals a deal. And from the papal palace, the Holy Father watches, smiling, indulgent, patient, as the world kneels before him in fear and desire. They will call him corrupt, they will call him monster, but Rodrigo Borgia will call himself something else. Chosen. He believes he was born not to serve God, but to become him. Before the world called him Alexander VI, he was a man of flesh, Rodrigo Borgia, and he understood that flesh was the only true language of power. He arrived in Rome as a young Spaniard, nephew to Pope Calixtus III, armed with charm, audacity, and the eyes of someone who already knew how the world worked. In those days, the city was less a capital of Christendom than a battlefield of appetites. The papacy was not a priesthood, it was a throne. Rodrigo learned its rules quickly. He discovered that piety mattered less than persuasion, and persuasion was best purchased with gold, favors, and the warmth of a smile that could promise anything. He climbed quietly through the ranks. Cardinal, vice-chancellor, diplomat, administrator, his reputation wrapped in silk. His enemies accused him of everything: greed, lust, bribery, simony. But they whispered it softly, because Rodrigo had the ear of every powerful man in Rome and the confidence of every dangerous woman. He was scandal and respectability fused into one, a man who could bless you with one hand and ruin you with the other. When he became pope, the world saw not a shepherd, but a prince. He walked through the Vatican gardens, surrounded by peacocks and servants, his robes heavy with gold thread. He received ambassadors as if they were courtiers in a royal palace, not pilgrims before the vicar of Christ. But behind the spectacle lay a kind of genius. Rodrigo did not see the church as holy ground. He saw it as infrastructure, the greatest machine of influence the world had ever built. He rebuilt Rome the way a merchant rebuilds a market, investing in art, patronage, and marriage alliances. The Vatican treasury became his private bank, cardinals his shareholders. He rewarded loyalty with titles and land, turning bishops into barons, priests into soldiers. And always the Borgia crest, a bull's head crowned in flame, hung over his halls like a signature. But no empire stands without heirs. Rodrigo's eyes turned toward his children, born in shadows but destined to rule in daylight. Cesare, brilliant, restless, too fierce for a cassock. Giovanni, charming and vain, more playboy than prince. And Lucrezia, his favorite, gentle in public, but capable of silence that could bend even her father's will. To the world, they were bastards. To Rodrigo, they were instruments of God's will, his will. He built their futures with the same ruthlessness he used to build the church's wealth. Cesare would rise through the hierarchy, perhaps even wear the papal crown one day. Giovanni would marry into nobility. Lucrezia would seal alliances through beauty and grace. The Pope's children became his theology, the proof that sin could be sanctified if it served the right purpose. Outside the Vatican walls, Rome murmured. Priests preached repentance while secretly attending feasts in the Borgia Palace, where music echoed through the marble corridors and laughter mingled with the scent of roses and incense. Rumors drifted like smoke, orgies disguised as banquets, confession turned into seduction, poison served in crystal cups. Yet even his critics admitted something grudgingly holy about his ambition. Rodrigo Borgia believed that God had made him in his own image, and that meant power was divine if you used it well. His prayers were half strategy, half gratitude. His faith was not hypocrisy, it was certainty. When he looked out over the city from the papal balcony, he saw not sin but order, the order he had imposed. Below, thousands bowed to his blessing. None knew that the same hand which formed the sign of the cross could also sign a death warrant before sunrise. And so, the man who became Pope ruled as both father and sovereign, confessor and conspirator. He would lift Rome to splendor and drag it through hell to do so. By the time the ink dried on the decrees naming him Alexander VI, the Vatican no longer resembled a church. It was a palace, a miniature empire wrapped in marble and silk, where prayers were currency and confession was a kind of diplomacy. The Holy See had become the most coveted throne in Europe, and Rodrigo Borgia sat upon it with the serene confidence of a monarch who believed heaven itself had validated his rule. Every morning, Rome awoke to a spectacle of order. Processions of scarlet and gold crossed St. Peter's Square. Trumpets echoed from the colonnades as messengers carried papal bulls across the continent, edicts of faith written in the same careful hand that signed marriage contracts and death warrants. The Borgia seal, a red bull crowned by flame, gleamed on each ribbon. It was the mark not only of the church, but of a family enterprise. Within the apostolic palace, the rooms glittered with frescoes and laughter. Artists, scholars, courtesans, and diplomats mingled beneath painted ceilings. What earlier popes had called sin, Alexander called life. To him, the church was not a monastic refuge. It was the center of civilization. Art was not vanity, it was propaganda. Beauty was power disguised as grace, and money, whether tithe or bribe, was the bloodstream that kept faith alive. Outside the gates, famine stalked peasants and plague-rotted cities. But inside these walls, music never ceased. Each evening, banquets stretched into dawn. Guests spoke of theology and trade, of wine and warfare, of whether virtue could survive success. The Pope's children attended, adorned like royalty, Cesare in crimson velvet, Lucrezia in pale gold. Their father called them his blessings, his enemies called them his blasphemies. Politics, too, took on a sacramental rhythm. Every papal office could be bought or bestowed. Every marriage was a treaty. Rodrigo's charm turned rivals into allies and allies into instruments. France, Spain, the Italian city-states, all courted the Vatican's favor, for the Pope could make or unmake kings with a sentence. Even the Medici in Florence bent their knees when letters came from Rome sealed in red wax. To the outside world, Alexander VI appeared invincible, a ruler anointed by God, reinforced by blood and gold. But within the corridors of the palace, a quieter truth pulsed. The Vatican was a kingdom built on tremors. Every alliance owed loyalty to ambition, not love. Every priest with a secret was a potential weapon. The Holy Father's greatest fear was not excommunication, it was betrayal. At his table sat not apostles, but strategists. His son Cesare, brilliant and restless, served as both counselor and executioner. His daughter Lucrezia, gentle yet calculating, became a tool of diplomacy, her marriages arranged and annulled like chapters in a larger story. Around them hovered cardinals whose smiles hid knives and mistresses whose kisses carried rumor. The Vatican had become a court where lust and sanctity shared the same bed. Yet for all its corruption, there was method in Alexander's madness. He unified Italy's fractured states under the shadow of the papacy, made the church a patron of art, and filled Rome with a confidence it had not known since Caesar. To his supporters, he was the Pope who had restored grandeur to the Holy City. To his critics, he was the Antichrist in silk. At night, he stood on his balcony and looked down upon the city that glimmered like oil on water. From here, he could see both the grandeur of St. Peter's Dome and the fires burning in the streets beyond. He knew that the same hand which could bless the faithful could summon soldiers. The same voice that offered salvation could also command death. He smiled, not with cruelty, but with comprehension. This was the truth of power, that holiness and sin were two wings of the same creature, and only those who embraced both could fly. In time, men would call Alexander VI a monster, others would call him a genius, but in that moment he called himself something simpler, necessary. Every empire has a sword. For the Borgias, that sword was Cesare, the Pope's favorite son, born not for prayer, but for conquest. From the moment he could walk, Cesare understood the contradictions of his blood. His father wore white robes and preached mercy, but ruled through fear and pleasure. His mother, Vanozza de Catanei, whispered of love and legacy, but Rome whispered something else, of bastards and blasphemy, of a family that broke commandments and rewrote them in gold. Cesare was raised in this paradox, and he thrived in it. He was educated by the finest minds of Italy, humanists, theologians, soldiers. He learned Latin, Greek, law, and the art of smiling while plotting. By 15, he was a cardinal. By 20, he was already tired of holiness. He wore crimson, but his heart beat for iron. He prayed, but his hands longed for a sword. To his father's delight, Cesare embodied everything the papacy needed: intelligence without conscience, ambition without hesitation. But within him burned a private impatience. He wanted not to serve God, nor even to serve the church, but to rule in his own name. He once told a friend that the only sin was weakness. In the eyes of Rome, he was the living contradiction of his father's reign, a prince of the church who hunted at dawn and seduced at dusk. His enemies called him the Antichrist's heir. His admirers, fewer but fiercer, called him the future. When his brother Giovanni, the official head of the papal army, was found murdered and floating in the Tiber, rumor turned its eyes toward Cesare. The Pope wept publicly, demanded justice, and privately remained silent. No killer was ever found. Cesare wore mourning for exactly 3 days, then asked to be released from his vows. The cardinal's robes came off like a disguise. That night, the Vatican lost a priest and gained a warlord. The Pope granted his wish. Cesare became commander of the papal forces, Duke of Valentinois, and husband to a French princess. He rode into battle clad in black armor, his family crest, a bull's head, etched into the steel. Behind him, banners of the cross fluttered like veils over graves. He conquered not in the name of faith, but in the name of order. To his soldiers, he was both savior and nightmare. He punished betrayal with poetry, a single red rose left on a corpse, a message written in blood. Towns that resisted him burned. Towns that surrendered flourished. He ruled through terror, but his terror was precise, never random, always useful. In Cesare, Machiavelli saw the purest expression of Renaissance politics, a man who understood that morality was a luxury for those who could afford failure. During his missions to Italy, the Florentine diplomat observed the young duke with fascination. Years later, he would write The Prince, and in its pages, the model of power, the perfect ruler without pity or illusion, would bear Cesare's shape. The son of the Pope became a prophecy, but the church that had given him life could not contain him. The cardinals feared him, the nobles envied him, and even his father, who had once smiled at his ambition, began to see what he had created. Cesare was no longer an instrument of papal will. He was his own storm. Yet for all his cruelty, he was not chaos. He dreamed of unity, of an Italy bound under one banner, free from foreign kings and fractious lords. His violence was deliberate, his rule efficient, his charisma impossible to ignore. Cities once ruled by thieves and tyrants found law and trade under his iron hand. Many cursed his name, more obeyed it. When he returned to Rome, the people lined the streets, some out of loyalty, others out of fear. The Pope watched from his balcony as Cesare dismounted before him, bowed deeply and kissed his ring. For a brief moment, father and son stood together, the living symbols of faith and force, two sides of one divine contradiction. And somewhere deep in his heart, Rodrigo Borgia understood the truth. He had not created a prince. He had created a god who no longer needed heaven. History remembers her as a whisper, Lucrezia Borgia, the golden daughter of a dark dynasty. To some, she was an angel surrounded by monsters. To others, she was the monster who learned to smile like an angel. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between. She was born into sin, but raised to embody grace. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, adored her beyond reason. Her brothers worshipped and used her in equal measure. From childhood, she learned that affection was never free, that beauty was both shield and weapon. In the Vatican, where lust and holiness dined at the same table, her golden hair and calm eyes became the most potent form of diplomacy. At 12, she was engaged for the first time. At 13, she was promised to another. By 15, she was married to a man she did not know, a political arrangement sealed not with love, but with strategy. She smiled at the wedding feast, veiled in gold, while her father toasted to peace among princes. But peace, in Borgia Rome, was just another word for temporary advantage. Her husband, Giovanni Sforza of Milan, would not last. Within 2 years, his alliance was no longer useful. A letter arrived, signed by the Pope himself. The marriage was annulled. The reason given: impotence. Rome laughed, Milan seethed, and Lucrezia, the innocent pawn, became the subject of poison-tipped gossip. Rumors multiplied like weeds. They said her beauty hid corruption, that her lovers met mysterious ends, that her father and brother loved her too much, in ways that could not be spoken. None of it could be proved. All of it was believed. In the palaces of Europe, her name became shorthand for temptation. Yet those who met her in person described not a seductress, but a woman of quiet intelligence, capable of both tenderness and calculation. While others spoke of sin, Lucrezia spoke of survival. Her father married her again, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, a nobleman of royal blood. For a brief moment she tasted happiness. Alfonso was young, handsome, and kind. They laughed together, walked in the gardens, spoke of children and music. But kindness had no place in the Vatican's politics. Alfonso was useful only until Cesare's alliances changed. One summer night, he was found in the courtyard, stabbed nearly to death. Lucrezia wept as she tended his wounds. Days later, he was strangled in his bed by men her brother had sent. She fainted when she saw the bruises on his neck. Rome said she had ordered it. Grief hardened into wisdom. Lucrezia learned what her father and brother had known all along, that love, like power, must be managed, not trusted. Her beauty became armor, her gentleness strategy. She smiled in rooms where others plotted her death. When whispers accused her of poison, she merely raised a cup of wine to her lips and drank first. By her third marriage to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, Lucrezia was no longer the girl of Vatican feasts. She was a duchess, a patron of poets, a mother, a ruler in her own right. The city that once feared her learned to admire her. She governed with intelligence and grace, turning Ferrara into a haven of art and order. The poisoner had become the peacemaker. But legends never die cleanly. Even as she grew older, the stories clung to her like perfume. The vial of arsenic hidden in a ring, the lovers who vanished, the eyes that could charm saints and sinners alike. History could not forgive her for being both victim and strategist. Men wrote about her beauty, none wrote about her survival, and so Lucrezia remains one of the great enigmas of the Renaissance. Half myth, half mirror. A woman born into a world that feared her power and desired it all the same. In her father's court she was a pawn. In her brother's wars, a bargaining chip. But in the eyes of time she became something greater. The proof that even in an age ruled by men and God, a woman could master both. There are two cups in the Vatican. One holds wine for the mass, the other poison for the unworthy. The Borgias learned to serve both with the same steady hand. In the heart of Renaissance Rome, sin had ceremony. To kill was not savagery, it was precision, strategy, an art perfected under candlelight. The streets whispered of a secret weapon, a potion known only to the Pope's physicians and apothecaries. Cantarella, they called it. Clear as water, sweet as honey, deadly as faith misused. It was said to leave no trace, no smell, no mercy. A single drop on the tongue, a few heartbeats of dizziness, and then a prayer half finished, a fall to the floor. Some swore that Lucrezia carried it in a hollow ring, others that Cesare tested it on prisoners before banquets. The truth is uncertain, but in a city where every alliance was sealed by a toast, it was enough that people believed. Power, after all, depends on fear more than fact. Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, understood this better than anyone. He knew that confession was the church's purest weapon, and poison its most elegant one. One saved souls, the other saved empires. Both required silence. At night, in the papal chambers, the Pope would hear the confessions of his own children. The words were never written, never repeated. What did they confess? Lust, betrayal, murder, perhaps only ambition. Rodrigo would listen, forgive, and bless them, because their sins were extensions of his own. To him, confession was not about cleansing, it was about control. To know what others hid was to own them completely. Outside, Rome trembled. Cardinals died suddenly, rivals fell ill after feasts, courtiers disappeared between dusk and dawn. Some believed the devil himself walked the marble halls, others suspected the more familiar evil of human hands. And through it all, the Borgias smiled, graceful, generous, untouchable. The irony was perfect. The church, built to absolve sin, had become a theater of it. The confessional was a stage, the poison its applause. But sin never stays contained. It spreads like ink in holy water. Cesare's wars began to falter, his allies grew restless, his father older. The whispers that had once been fear turned into opportunity. Enemies plotted, emboldened by their hatred. In taverns and chapels alike, they spoke of divine vengeance, that heaven itself would punish the family that had turned salvation into business. Then one summer evening, at a banquet meant to celebrate reconciliation between feuding cardinals, the Pope and his son fell ill. The wine had been poured from the wrong flask, or perhaps the right one. For days, Rome held its breath. Cesare survived, pale and trembling. But Rodrigo Borgia, the man who ruled like a god, did not. They said the poison that killed him was his own, that he had been undone by the very craft he perfected. Some called it justice, others irony. As he lay dying, witnesses claimed he clutched the crucifix so tightly the gold bent beneath his fingers. No priest dared speak of his sins. No confession was heard. The man who had absolved everyone else left the world unforgiven. When the bells tolled, Rome wept and celebrated in equal measure. The Vatican that had once glowed with light now reeked of incense and decay. The Holy Father's ring was broken, his name cursed. The dynasty he built began to crumble, devoured by the same darkness that had sustained it. Yet the legend did not die. Because poison, like power, never truly disappears. It changes form, passes to other hands, hides in other chalices. The Borgias had shown the world that morality is negotiable, that holiness and corruption can drink from the same cup. And every confession since then, every whispered "Forgive me, Father," has carried a faint echo of their laughter. The bells that rang for Alexander VI did not sound like mourning. They sounded like release. Rome exhaled, a city that had lived too long beneath one man's shadow, too long beneath the weight of divine ambition turned human. In the palaces, candles burned low. The Vatican corridors, once filled with laughter and scheming, lay silent except for the echo of footsteps and the faint hum of flies around the draped body of the dead Pope. The corpse of Rodrigo Borgia darkened quickly, bloating, the skin turning the color of old bronze. The doctors whispered that poison had done its work too well. Servants refused to touch him. It was said the smell drove even the cardinals to retreat, leaving the vicar of Christ to decay in the room he had ruled as a king. There was no dignity left in death, only irony. The man who had commanded nations could not command his own flesh. Outside, the city trembled with rumors. Had the poison been meant for someone else? Had Cesare planned his father's death, or merely survived it? Truth blurred, as it always does when the powerful fall. Cesare, half recovered from his own sickness, clung to life and control alike. His face was pale, his hands still trembling from fever, but his mind burned clear. He gathered the guards, sealed the Vatican treasury, and ordered the keys to be delivered to him alone. For a brief moment, it seemed that the empire would endure, that the son would wear the father's crown. But the throne of St. Peter has no heirs. Without a pope, every promise the Borgias had made dissolved like ink in rain. The cardinals, freed from fear, turned on them instantly. Gold vanished, alliances reversed, and the Vatican became a battlefield of whispers once more. In distant courts, old enemies smiled. The Borgia miracle was over. When the new pontiff was chosen, a rival whom Rodrigo had once humiliated, Cesare found the doors of the church closed to him. He tried to rally his armies, but fortune had shifted. Storms wrecked his ships, mercenaries deserted, and the French crown withdrew its favor. The man who had once ridden through Italy like judgment itself now fled through the hills in disguise, hunted by the same lords who had once kissed his ring. Captured, stripped of title and armor, Cesare spent his last years wandering from prison to exile. Still, he dreamed of return, of conquest, of unity. Even in chains, he carried himself like a ruler, writing letters filled with plans that would never come to pass. In one of them, he confessed, not to a priest, but to himself that he had trusted fortune too much and friends too little. At dawn one spring morning in 1507, in a nameless skirmish outside Navarre, Cesare met his end. Surrounded by enemies, his sword broken, his body pierced with blades, he fell beneath the same sky that had once burned for him. They say he died in silence, without prayer or fear, facing his killers with the faintest trace of a smile, as if death were just another negotiation. His naked corpse was left on the field, stripped of armor and jewels. A peasant buried him by the roadside. No choir sang, no bell rang. And so ended the House of Borgia, not with apocalypse, but with exhaustion. Their palaces stood empty, their enemies reclaimed their thrones, their name became a warning disguised as legend. To some, they were monsters. To others, visionaries. To history, they remain both. Yet their shadow lingered. Machiavelli, writing in Florence, would immortalize Cesare as the model of the prince, ruthless, disciplined, modern. Painters continued to depict Lucrezia's calm gaze, poets continued to curse her name, and deep within the Vatican, new popes learned the lesson the Borgias had paid for in blood, that holiness, once wedded to power, never divorces cleanly. In the end, perhaps the Borgias were not extraordinary. Perhaps they were only honest about what the world already was, a world where saints wear crowns and sinners build cathedrals. Rome would rise again, the papacy reborn in splendor and control. But beneath every fresco, beneath every sermon, the echo of the Borgias remained, reminding the faithful that behind every holy empire, there lies a family willing to do what heaven cannot. There are men who die, and there are men who continue as ideas. Cesare Borgia became the latter. When his body rotted beneath a Spanish sky, another man, Niccolò Machiavelli, was still haunted by the memory of him. The Florentine diplomat had once walked beside Cesare during the campaigns in Romagna. He had seen him negotiate with kings, seduce cities, and command men with nothing more than the weight of his gaze. Cesare's empire had been brief, but it had glowed with the terrible brilliance of something inevitable. Years later, Machiavelli would write The Prince, a book that changed how the world understood power. He would dedicate it to the Medici, but its heartbeat was Cesare's. In those pages, Machiavelli described a ruler freed from illusion, one who understood that morality was a language for sermons, not for thrones. He wrote that fear was safer than love, that deception was a tool, not a sin, and that fortune favored those who shaped it with their own hands. He called this man virtuoso, not in virtue, but in mastery. He might as well have written the name Borgia across every chapter. To the moralists of Europe, the book was blasphemy. To kings and generals, it was revelation. The world had changed, and the Borgias had shown how. Religion was no longer enough to govern. The divine right of rulers was fading. In its place rose the art of control, the science of appearance, manipulation, and timing. Cesare Borgia, in life, had embodied it. Machiavelli, in words, had refined it. But even Machiavelli saw the tragedy behind the genius. In one of his letters, he wrote that Cesare possessed every gift except longevity. He had built his kingdom on human hands, not divine favor, and human hands are fickle. If fortune had not turned against him, Machiavelli said, the result of his power would have been unequaled. In that single sentence, history met philosophy, the recognition that greatness and ruin are often the same moment seen from different sides. Through Machiavelli, the Borgia vision survived. Their methods became the skeleton of modern states, diplomacy as deceit, faith as theater, law as persuasion. Princes and popes, generals and CEOs would one day speak the same language Cesare had whispered in the Vatican halls. The age of divine rule was ending. The age of human calculation had begun. Yet something darker lingers beneath the admiration. Machiavelli's prince is not a hymn. It is a mirror. It shows what we are willing to forgive when results favor us. It reminds us that we still measure power not by its virtue, but by its efficiency. Every time a leader lies for the greater good, every time a cause excuses cruelty in the name of order, Cesare breathes again. His ghost does not haunt the church, it haunts the present. And in that haunting lies a strange truth. The Borgias did not invent corruption. They revealed it. They tore the veil from human nature and made it impossible to pretend again. After them, the world could no longer believe that faith and power were separate. The papal tiara had become a crown, and the cross a sword. For Machiavelli, this was not heresy, it was honesty. For history, it was a prophecy. The irony is that the prince itself was banned by the church, its author condemned for the same clarity that the Borgias had lived by. Yet in secret, every ruler read it. Every man who sought to control others kept it by his bedside. And so, centuries later, when we speak of politics, manipulation, or the cost of ambition, we still speak the language written by a Florentine and inspired by a Spaniard's son. The church may have buried Cesare Borgia, but Machiavelli resurrected him, not as a man, but as a method. The Pope's son had become something far greater and far more dangerous, a theory that never dies. The Borgias should have vanished with their bodies, burned away by scandal, buried beneath Vatican silence, and yet somehow they endured. Because legends, unlike dynasties, do not need heirs. They need only fascination. For 5 centuries, the name Borgia has refused to die. Painters, poets, playwrights, all return to it, drawn as moths to a candle that both illuminates and burns. Some painted Lucrezia as the pale Madonna of corruption, holding a chalice of poison instead of Christ's blood. Others sketched Cesare as the perfect Renaissance tyrant, handsome, tragic, merciless. Rodrigo, the Pope, became every corrupted patriarch that art required, a figure too sinful to be real and too real to ignore. The church, eager to forget, did the opposite of what it intended. By denouncing them, it ensured their immortality. Because people always listen more closely when you tell them not to. During the Baroque age, dramatists revived their story in velvet and shadow. The Romantics turned them into symbols of forbidden beauty. By the time the 19th century arrived, Lucrezia was no longer just a daughter of Rome. She was every misunderstood woman, every scapegoat of men's desire and fear. Cesare became the emblem of unrepentant genius, the man who reached too far and paid the price. Even in modern times, the Borgias remain alive. In cinema, they wear the faces of kings and villains. In novels, they speak through mafiosi and magnates. In politics, their shadow lingers in the corridors of power, those who smile while planning, who preach morality while counting gold. Every empire that masks control behind virtue owes something to them. Their legacy is not faith or art or conquest. It is revelation, the understanding that every institution, even the holiest, carries the heartbeat of human hunger. The Borgias did not create corruption. They revealed how naturally it grows when clothed in sanctity. In that sense, their story is timeless. Look closely at any age, and you will find them. When corporations preach ethics while exploiting the weak, Rodrigo smiles again. When leaders charm the public with benevolence while silencing dissent, Cesare rides once more. When beauty is sold as power and innocence becomes a performance, Lucrezia lifts her golden cup. Art remembers what history tries to bury. Caravaggio painted saints with the faces of thieves. Shakespeare's villains spoke like princes. And behind every Renaissance fresco of the Virgin, you can almost hear the Borgias breathing, the reminder that purity and desire share the same palette of light and shadow. There are those who still visit their tombs, not to pray, but to witness. The stones are cracked, the inscriptions worn, but the air carries a strange calm, as if even God has accepted their place in his design. Perhaps he always had. After all, The story of the Borgias is not about defiance of heaven. It is about the impossibility of being fully human and fully holy at once. Their rise and fall became the mirror in which Europe saw itself. Beautiful, cruel, brilliant, and doomed. And so, the family that poisoned kings, bought salvation, and loved too dangerously continues to live wherever ambition touches faith. Every time power kisses piety, every time morality bends before necessity, a Borgia is reborn. Because the legacy of sin is not damnation, it is imitation. Night falls over Rome, and the stones remember. The marble of St. Peter's gleams under the soft weight of moonlight. The fountains murmur like old confessors, carrying secrets no prayer can cleanse. Somewhere beneath these streets, under centuries of dust and devotion, lies the city the Borgias once ruled. A city that learned how holiness and sin could share the same breath. If you stand long enough before the Vatican gates, you can still feel it, the faint tremor of their story in the air. The echo of Cesare's boots across the cobblestones. The rustle of Lucrezia's gown through a corridor, perfumed with incense and deceit. The sigh of a pope who believed himself eternal. The empire is gone, yet its shadow lingers, stretching across every marble saint that watches the square below. 500 years have passed, and still we are haunted by their reflection. Because the Borgias were never only a family, they were a mirror. They showed the world what happens when men who preach of heaven begin to build their own. They exposed the thin line between faith and power, between redemption and desire, between serving God and becoming Him. And in truth, that line still runs through us. We have not escaped their legacy. We have only learned to disguise it better. Our altars are digital now, our confessions public, our poisons more subtle. But the hunger, the need to be adored, obeyed, forgiven, remains the same. We still trade virtue for influence, forgiveness for fame. We still tell ourselves that the end justifies the means. The only difference is that we do it with gentler smiles. Perhaps that is why their story endures, because it is not theirs alone. Each of us, in some quiet corner of our soul, has played both priest and sinner, both the forgiver and the condemned. We have all mixed the wine and the poison in the same cup and called it truth. Yet, beneath the weight of corruption, there was something undeniably human in them, something that refuses to die. The same spark that built cathedrals, painted ceilings, wrote music that outlived its composers. The Borgias sinned boldly because they lived boldly. They reached for God with one hand and held a dagger in the other, believing both to be holy tools. And maybe that is why we cannot look away. So tonight, traveler, as the bells of Rome fall silent and the marble cools, think not only of their sins, but of what they reveal about our own. The world they ruled was not so different from ours. It merely spoke its hypocrisy in Latin. Power still tempts, beauty still deceives, faith still bargains. Close your eyes and you can almost hear it. The whisper of silk, the clink of goblets, the echo of laughter from a feast long ended. Somewhere, perhaps, Cesare still rides through the darkness, and Lucrezia still watches from a balcony, her golden cup catching the light of the moon. Their story is finished. Ours is not. Tell me, traveler, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? May your faith be your own. May your truth not require poison. And may your power never need forgiveness. Until next time, sleep well and remember what history never absolves.